Capcom keep on cooking up some tasty treats, and none come bigger and more popular than Monster Hunter and their massive modern portfolio. The early access beta released late last year, and again this month ahead of the full release at the end. Now, thanks to a big help from my far more knowledgeable and skilled youngest son in all things Monster Hunter, whom is playing much of the footage in this video, I wanted to investigate what the RE engine has in store for us, what those PC and console specs actually mean, and if this is a monster that may be a little hard to swallow. Now, I know I've been away for a long period of time, and there's a multitude of reasons I won't bore you with on that. Some of them coming on the channel soon in terms of where I've been away in January and what I did at the CES and some other stuff in work and life. But anyway, just to summarise, apologies for not being around for a few months. I have done some IGN stuff, you can go and check that out as well. But let's get into this one in terms of, this is another random access one, so I'm just going to do this in terms of bullet points to discuss, captured footage, and then we can talk it through. So again, feedback if you like this or not. So the first thing is, the site itself, Capcom, they released kind of a full breakdown of the various min, recommended, and maximum spec applications for PC. The first thing you realise is they're forcing it all over the menu when you boot the game up. Upscaling and frame gen continue to be a concerning push within the industry because everyone's getting heavily involved in it, and now I get the benefits of it, and I've mentioned them before. It's easier to be able to get better performance with less optimization, but fundamentally you lower the base and everybody starts targeting that as the new high, and therefore the overall technical footing gets lower. As Michelangelo said, it's not that most of us aim too high and miss the target, it's the fact that we aim too low and hit it. So everybody just goes lower down the technical stack in terms of targeting. I'm not going to bother targeting 4K as a native resolution, I'll just target 1440p and use upscaling back to 4K. So therefore you're automatically starting from a lower point. So that's the first problem that I've got. If you throw in frame generation, then again, you've got to be targeting 60 FPS in my opinion for it to make that work. I said before, you can do lower, but fundamentally it's not really, in my opinion, designed for that, and there's a multitude of reasons I won't discuss here. I have discussed on some other videos, but fundamentally the PC specs, yeah, they're a little concerning. They're a little concerning in terms of what they are recommending on the actual menus in terms of the minimum maximum specifications, and again all of them are using upscaling and frame generation to get to that target 60 FPS. And they released a benchmark which gives us a lot of answers, and I've dug into that quite a bit in this video, so we'll cover that in a few minutes. The PS5 Pro is also on there, gets specific enhancements which include ray tracing, at least in the console space. They're exclusive to it, which is a rarity that is now growing less and less so as more games and patches are dropping for the PS5 Pro, but again it definitely needs to get more and more games that push it further. But again, there's another area on that which I'll discuss later on in the video. And the beta only had 2 modes for consoles, with 120 FPS option providing 4 actual ways to play as long as you have the screen to support it. So the final game has 3, which is the same as PS5 on all versions. So the PS5 Pro has resolution mode, frame rate mode, and a balance mode in the middle of 40 FPS, and both the PS5 base and the Series X base all have that, sans the RT, which is locked out set for PS5 Pro and PC. Now the Series S has 1 single mode, that's it, and it's basic 1080p. So I'll come back to the consoles again in a minute, but I'm just going to concentrate on the PC because there's quite a lot to discuss, and it kind of highlights where the game and engine's at. A little concerning, and I've seen people all over the internet videoing and testing this benchmark for GPUs. I don't know why. It generally isn't a GPU benchmark, but there are parts of it that are. But again, let's step through it. So thanks to that benchmark that they released, it kind of does present a pretty stable view of the game's PC quality. Out of the box, it's far superior to the PC port we got with Worlds, at least on NVIDIA machines. Now, performance seems good, and frame times are, although not great, do not have huge fluctuations frame to frame mostly. However, VSync is off, which helps greatly, and it is a fixed run with emulated gameplay and cutscenes. And even on my top-end RTX 5090 7950X machine, we get a huge swathe of frame times and thus final rates when moving into open areas, NPCs. It has a huge shader comp at the start, which is still present and could take closer to 20 minutes on my AMD rig with a 5600X CPU. It's around half that or slightly more on my 7950X machine, and over 30 minutes on the little Steam Deck. So once that's done, we've seen no obvious shader comp stutter. However, I do note again my first point that this is a canned run, that although it deviates slightly as per real gameplay dynamic elements, it does present a controlled and thus fixed path, and therefore best case scenario. So on face value, we can run anywhere between 70 FPS and 130 FPS but data and CPU can still become a limiting factor, specifically single and triple thread limits on wider CPUs, and overall it is CPU limited more often on my 5600X over 60 FPS. Now here, at 1440p FSR3 balanced run at ultra settings with ray tracing, no frame gen, we are greatly underutilizing the GPU with lower command queue and power draw. Ramping up resolution is best here, as you will not be any faster on this machine, but visual quality will increase for free, so to speak, air quotes, as we reduce the bubbles on that GPU time. Now this is where frame gen could help to match that 120Hz or higher panels native refresh you may have. It also shows up the ray tracing cost is very low, relatively. At least on my 5090 machine, it appears to use ray traced AO and GI and reflections, which can be hard to notice even in side-by-sides. Here we can see increased occlusion on rocks and objects, but reflections are most apparent, although limited here. Now on this rig, Ray Tracing Ultra costs approximately 8% of performance, with worst case being around 15% on water bodies. So if you have a good rig, it looks okay, but final game will likely show a bigger hit here and across the entire gamut. This may be very similar levels of AO and GI that we saw in Dragon's Dogma 2, because it's the same engine. Now PS5 Pro tested here, from the beta at least, does not have any enhancements over the PS5 version, aside performance boost. So for visuals, now without final code at least, the PS5 Pro is just a faster version of the PS5. Expect the final game, based on this PC test anyway, to be close to ultra settings with ray tracing at that 30 and 40 FPS options. That is the ceiling there for that target frame rate, although it may still be unlocked. Don't know, it is definitely unlocked in the version here, but it's not the same one that we're going to get in the final game. And then the resolution mode targets 4K across both Series X, PS5 and thus PS5 Pro from RE Engine's own checkerboard or interlace mode across PS5 and Series X. Now this is interleave pixels, it's jittered per frame, which I've discussed on many prior videos. Now effectively this means little, as I've covered to death since starting my channel way back in 2013. The visual quality and geometry or depth resolution of the image is only one factor. Now, as per my Dragon's Dogma 2 review on IGN and my updated one here, image quality and rendering resolution are split. And we saw that on the Xbox consoles. Many of the expensive alpha, buffer and other effects were of a lower resolution and quality than PS5, even though they ran at both 4K checkerboard. As here, the performance mode lowers that base resolution quite significantly in the image quality setting, as well as per the old PC menu, to a much lower quality, meaning hair, alpha, textures, post effects, such as screen space reflections and masking artifacts are all very, very blocky and low quality, as do textures, at least in the beta, because they are cut back for size, with lower sampling and filtering in places. Now the Series S is by far the worst of the lot, by a huge margin at times, but also only renders at 1080p, and only has a single mode, although the effectively unlocked 120Hz mode is still an option, but more on that in a moment. Now, textures stand out between Series S and Series X and PS5, but also between resolution and frame rate mode. But the most apparent is easily performance, with the resolution mode really only targeting 30 FPS, but in the 120 FPS mode, we can unlock and see the limits of each of the consoles. Again, it's not a shock that the wider Series X GPU and bandwidth help in the resolution mode, with a very small but measurable 2% improvement over the base PS5 across this run of identical gameplay. There are some points where it's slightly higher, and even where the PS5 is slightly higher, but generally it is more GPU bound in this mode, and it definitely needs to be capped at 30 FPS, although the balance mode with improvements and changes to the image quality with the FSR1 the game is going to use on the final release is probably going to make a significant impact to performance, but potentially it might also lower image quality even further than what we're seeing here. In the favour of frame rate, or prioritised frame rate mode, with that 120Hz option enabled, we see that this puts more strain on the data throughput to the I/O blocks, and thus the CPU side, which should not surprise that this time the PS5 flip-flops and takes the lead, although the team's knowledge of the PlayStation API and such may also help. As such, the PS5 can be between 2 to 12% faster in certain aligned points, but over this fixed benchmark run, which mirrors some of the PC one you've just seen, the PS5 ends this run 5% faster than the Xbox Series X. Now, settings look identical aside a small change in GI and AO, but again, this is a beta with lots of bugs in it, so I'm not even going to spend too much time talking about this. The Series S looks similar with reduced AO and GI elements, so overall, the Series S seems to be closer to the resolution mode in terms of settings here, but it's somewhere in between that and the FPS mode in reality. The FPS mode is far brighter with like a higher GI bounce in all versions, but again, that looks like reduced versions of AO, and it's likely a screen-spaced AO here. Now, all this is likely not that relevant anyway, because the final version of the game, like I say, will change all the settings. We know it won't run checkerboarding anymore. Ray tracing is turned off on all consoles at launch, but it does seem to be a commercial decision, as I alluded to at the start, more than a technical one, in my opinion. And there's a few elements to this in terms of what I mentioned at the start with the frame generation, the ray tracing and upscaling. Generally what they've done in their engine is shifted away from their own solution, which, okay, had its own problems, but fundamentally it was a solution that worked quite well and was one of the earlier ones in the generation to improve performance. In fact, when I reviewed Resident Evil 7, I believe I was the only person to call out they were using half width and half height resolution on that game. That's how early they were doing it before anyone else was talking about it, and they've only really improved that but put more stress through the engine when they do it. On consoles like PC, again, it's very memory limited. The whole impact of the game is flip-flopping heavily on GPU, then CPU, then data throughput, and it's constantly juggling data and memory all around, which means performance isn't very consistent, and even in the beta there's some erratic frame times with it sometimes hitting 40, 50, 60 milliseconds in some spikes, even longer in between cutscenes. There is some 100 millisecond hits on the beta here, which I hope all those things are ironed out in the final game. So moving back to the bigger consoles and the premium console on the PS5 Pro, there's certainly some areas where it can boost over the base PS5. Best case scenario here, it's around 90 versus 70 something, so 20% delta. That's in the best case on the FPS mode. But over the run, there's not a huge delta here because, again, it's data stroke CPU bound. You can see the on-screen metrics. I compared the frame rate mode with the PS5 because that was the faster of the two, around 5% faster than the Xbox Series X. PS5 Pro there is 17% faster. But the resolution mode, it gets to stretch its legs a little more with the GPU. On there, the Xbox Series X was around 2% faster than the PS5, so I used that, and that's why you're seeing around 36% improvement over the Xbox Series X in that resolution mode, and slightly more to the PS5. Fundamentally, the PS5 Pro is not that significantly higher in this version, but again, a lot of that won't be hardware-based. It will be fully code-based and how they're using the data, so this will probably improve significantly in terms of how the game would operate if they were in the same versions, but they're not going to. The PS5 Pro is going to move to PSSR, which will have a bigger impact on performance, certainly GPU load, and therefore image quality should be much better, but performance will probably draw back down closer to what we're seeing between PS5 and Xbox Series X. It will still be faster, obviously, but it won't be as big as the deltas we're seeing here, which could be a 20%, give or take, over the Xbox Series X and PS5, which is not massive, but still pretty sizable in terms of overall performance. That makes the PS5 Pro the only viable 60 FPS if we took this code as that launch version, and I don't expect it will be a huge difference when the game does launch. The Steam Deck kind of represents where it doesn't scale, so this is kind of where the highlights of all the issues I've mentioned really come to fruition, because no matter what you do with the settings, you can't go below a certain base. So here, the Steam Deck is running ultra performance 720p, so that's 427 by 240 base resolution at the absolute lowest settings, and it can only still manage an average FPS of into the low 20s. It's totally unplayable on the Steam Deck at the moment, and that's fine because it's a beta, but again, I don't expect the final game to be significantly better because there's nowhere else for this particular piece of hardware to go, and the PC version, similar to the console versions, they've made decisions to get the game out, I believe, in terms of commercial decisions, on a timeline that needs to hit the March deadline that they have, or February, before the quarter end. So you can see here on the Steam Deck that it's in, you know, it's way below N64 levels. It's 10 FPS, 12 FPS. It can't go any lower. The image quality looks bad, even on the handheld screen, and it isn't something that I can recommend at this point. And it points to the stuff that I've mentioned throughout this video in terms of performance. The game is very memory limited. The benchmark in terms of the PC, what you see on the Steam Deck and on the PC, it's split into 3 core tests. So I get why they've done it. It's a very good benchmark in terms of how the game uses the hardware that it runs on. So first section is largely cutscene, so GPU bound. it still has quite a big load on data streaming shot to shot, and thus the CPU can do a lot of decompressing the data being streamed in. So this puts a lot of load on the SSD, the memory, the CPU bandwidth, and then the GPU. So the first section is definitely mostly GPU bound, but you will get stutters and judders and underutilization no matter what you do. The second section that continues, that's kind of starts off CPU bound as it streams in and memory bound, and then it quickly becomes memory bound as you move through the level and it brings stuff in. Then fill rate and bandwidth bound as it starts streaming in new data, that dynamic weather, it shifts the time of day, all of that does in real time. And then we also see some possible just general context and likely general code issues throughout. So a lot of the dynamic monsters, the pathfinding, the collision, the skinning, all of that can cause issues in terms of context switching. It can flip-flop, and it leans heavier on the GPU at certain points, specifically that dense fill rate in the grass, and then it kind of speeds up as you get into the sand where there's less fill rate. And it's likely the most accurate test of how the game on any given machine will play large portions of it, certainly. And then the final part is all CPU bound. The physics, the interaction, the pathfinding, the NPCs, all the stuff that we've seen on Dragon's Dogma 2. It sees a huge hit to performance and will likely be the worst case for most of it, as it can only spread the work across 3 to 4 cores. And you can see it on the utilization, and some of the tools that are out there now are going a bit mad trying to give you information in terms of like GPU busy, GPU wait, and I've seen big tech channels talking about it as if it's some specific metric. You can't know what the GPU is doing outside of knowing what the engine's doing. The GPU can be very busy doing nothing. You can draw a black screen and whack the GPU up in terms of what you're throwing at it in utilization. So the actual load that you get out of a measurement is only a piece of information that's only good in context of everything else. The game can flip-flop, and frame time is a good example of where some of it might be slowing it down, but it still doesn't mean it's utilizing the GPU very well. And there are generally areas across even the Steam Deck at these settings where it's GPU underutilized. And that just generally means it's not getting fed very well. And those GPU bubbles I keep talking about. So it can use up to 12 threads. So it's not as if it's not using the CPU threads very well, but generally it's limited by probably a render thread, a physics thread, and maybe a worker thread that's managing the whole lot, and that's why you're seeing that 3 or 4 flip-flop. But generally it looks like they've got very heavy CPU code, and again, I mentioned this before, when you're doing this kind of parallel work and workloads, any async work has to have a lockstep. You've got to get back into lockstep. So sync lock everything. And vsync is one example of it. But in a game like this, where it's streaming data all the time, it's juggling memory in and out, buffers all the time, using CPU and compute, I'm sure, between GPU and CPU, it hits PC really, really hard, but it's still using the consoles very hard as well. And you can see the performance frame times are generally worse on Xbox consoles and PS5 because of all of that offloaded work that console does over and above. And this is a good example of it where the engine is really streaming that in heavily. But overall, it's more CPU bound. Most people will find this game CPU bound in the PC space. And no matter what you do with the settings, you won't be able to improve frame rates over and above where that CPU or memory is your limit. So if you want to test how good your whole system's set up, your memory timings, your memory speeds in terms of the overall system, the SSD, the PCIe, this is the game to do it with. It certainly seems a very good game. I don't mean that in a good way. I mean, right now it needs to work some of those issues out. But it's likely CPU memory bound most of the time on PC, and that's true on Steam Deck, and in some ways very true on consoles. Hence why the frame rate mode doesn't significantly move up, because it's no longer GPU bound, it's CPU stroke data bound, and that's why we're not seeing huge deltas. Final thoughts ahead of the game's release later this week. I think the beta was good. I think the benchmark is great that they put it out there. I think it's good that people get a chance to run this on their PCs and get an idea of how it runs. The main thing I'm most concerned about is the whole amount of work that industries are doing to lean heavily into utilizing all this proprietary tech that comes with hardware vendors and an engine specifically. And I mean, the changes from beta to release are larger than most. New modes and even rendering options are not new in and of themselves, but all of them together and removing their own in-house proprietary upscaling solution made in conjunction with the RE engine from inception with an inferior spatial upscaler in FSR1, along with no ray tracing at all on base consoles, seems vaguely commercial related in my opinion. We know it works well, and options could exist and do already exist even at launch. but they are not here, even on PC, and instead base consoles are left with a potentially inferior IQ, albeit possibly better performance, for a game that can struggle with IQ in the FPS mode currently, and with FSR 1, this could be even worse. Now, there obviously are huge mitigating factors for this. Improved Q4 timeline. Like I say, they are definitely doing this to get this out the door, and options, again, would be nice, but I understand it. It's probably a streamlined Moscow approach in terms of the release candidate they've got, where they pick and choose what they're going to get out there. And frame gen on a PC as a requirement for 60 FPS, that is always a red flag to me, because you should never have that as an option. With the hardware that's out there, you know, the RTX 5090 can obviously go way above 60 FPS, and in fact it averages into the hundreds nearly at maximum settings 4K DLSS, which only gives you about 20% performance improvement back from native 4K, but generally, by and large, it's a better image quality, although there are some areas in terms of foliage and certainly volumetric clouds that can struggle a little bit on DLSS 3. But again, it doesn't even use DLSS 4, the far superior version I've covered over on IGN. It does use the latest FSR 3 on PC, XE, SS, and obviously PSSR on Pro, which, like I said, will lower performance. But again, these are all their own hardware vendor solutions, and there's no other option but to use these now, where there was before. Now, all this adds up to a rushed polish cycle with the standard chip now, finish later approach. And I'm sure Final Code will be better on performance than what we're seeing in the beta, at least. PC likely not significantly different, but image quality will likely be worse on the base consoles than what we see, and PC will struggle on many machines based on the close to Final Code benchmark I'm testing here. Now, only PS5 Pro with PSSR and ray tracing remains a focus on the final game, and most certainly a day one patch updates that will likely come. But I am interested to see just how this game runs when we get our hands on Final Code, and I'll be covering it over on IGN. But in the here and now, I am a little concerned around the performance on the base consoles, image quality specifically, the options they've made to get to that point, and certainly on PC I think it might be very demanding and people might not be happy with the overall performance across a variety of machines. And not running on the Steam Deck I think will also impact sales, although I don't think they've got much to worry about on the sales front. Anyway, I think I've gone on far enough. This was a quick video just to try and get something out that I've been for a while. Hopefully it wasn't too long and waffly. Remember, if you like what I do, I'm completely independent, self-funded. You can like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and I will try and get a regular cadence of stuff coming forward, because hopefully I'll have a little bit more time to just breathe, let alone do some fun stuff like this. Hopefully I've got a lot more stuff coming up, and I will be covering this game in depth over on IGN very, very soon, so you can check that out soon. But for now, I'm out, and I will catch you on the next one.